With that, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Christoper Merritt has more than 30 years of ride and show design experience creating theme park attractions and environments around the world. He served as an art director and production designer at theme parks in California, Florida, Tokyo, Singapore, and Shanghai. And while he's led huge creative projects, I'll just point out that he's also created a smaller project that happens to be a favorite of mine, the walk-through adventure inside Sleeping Beauty's castle at Disneyland. So it's such a small...
Lots of other people worked on that besides me.
Yes, lots of other people worked on that too, but I always think of you as I walk through there because I know you had a big hand in that. Chris's books include Knott's Preserved, From Boysenberry to Theme Park, and Knott's Berry Tales, A Complete History of the Whimsical Attraction, both with Eric Linksweiler. Pacific Ocean Park, The Rise and Fall of Los Angeles Space Age Nautical Pleasure Pier, with Dominic Priori. And of course, Marc Davis, in his own words, Imagineering the Disney Theme Parks, which he wrote with Pete Docter, and which he was kind enough to donate a copy of. It's in our silent auction. So
signed by Pete.
Signed by Pete and Chris. So also pretty darn cool. So thank you for that. If you Disney fans out there loved the old e-ticket magazine the way I did, you can also thank Chris for being instrumental in helping keep that wonderful historical journal going in its last years. He breathed more life into it than it would have had otherwise, and we're all grateful for that. Disneyland history, as you may know, there's been a lot written about Disneyland and Disney, and a little bit of research done, and a lot of that research has been done by Chris. There's a lot of, it's hard to find good, solid Disneyland history, and he's responsible for a lot of it. So we're very pleased to have him here today. Thank you, Chris Merritt.
Thank you. Wow. Well, I don't know how I'm ever supposed to live up to that. Dr. Jepson, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Oh, let me get my phone working again. Yep, see, there we go. All right. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for having me. Like Chris said, I am also Chris, part of the Chris Club. And so what I'm going to be talking about this evening, well, first of all, again, Chris kind of let it off, but I am a theme park... Hold it up closer. Hold it up like this. Yes. It's Drive Time Hour with Chris Jepson. I'm a theme park designer. I've been in the industry for 35 plus years. I specialize in dark rides and shows like that. I've worked at parks all around the world, from here in our backyard in Southern California to Singapore to Shanghai and China, all over the place. And most of my career working for either Disney, the Mouse, or Universal, who I'm currently working for. So, and yes, I'm a big fan of history and books and all that. And so what I'm going to share with you has a bit to do with that. When I was a college student in the early 90s, and before that I was a Jungle Cruise skipper at Disneyland, if you can believe that. Yes, told the terrible jokes and shot the hippo, which was fun. But I grew up here in Southern California. I loved Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm. It had a huge impact on me and made me basically want to be a theme park designer. And basically, someone at the table was asking me, how did you get into this? And I just remembered because in the 90s, there was really no place to go to learn how to be a theme park designer. There weren't really books. There certainly wasn't the internet. So much of this you can teach yourself now, but you couldn't back then. And so my solve for that was to hunt down and find people who worked on theme parks, and especially Knott's and Disneyland. And in Disney in particular, a lot of the art directors and designers had retired in the Los Angeles or Orange County area. So it wasn't impossible for me to seek these people out and talk to them. And so my thought was, well, I'll talk to them, I'll say, can I ask you about history? But I'll also say, well, do you have old artwork? And tell me how you designed a show. And so I was both trying to preserve history because I was always interested in it, but I also was trying to learn how do you do the business. So this gentleman I'm about to talk about, Marc Davis, was a huge influence on me because of that. So that, without further blathering, that is who I'm going to talk about tonight. So let's go ahead and start this off. All right, so this is Marc Davis, and Marc Davis, amazing artist, designer, animator, and theme park designer. Believe it or not, that's me at the tender age of 20 interviewing Marc, and the story, again, without boring you to tears. I was a Jungle Cruise skipper in late 89, early 90, and I was about to go to CalArts to learn to study animation, and there was an exhibit for the first time of the Disney Gallery, which was brand new, and before that, they didn't really show a lot of the Disney concept artwork for the theme parks, but they did at the Disney Gallery, and I remember going on my break and going up to the gallery and looking, and there were all these Marc Davis drawings on the wall of Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion, and I went, oh my gosh, that's the guy, and my head exploded, and the reason my head exploded was when I was a little kid, my mom had all these souvenir guidebooks, and I used to collect souvenir guidebooks going to Disneyland. The Pirates of the Caribbean souvenir guidebook is full of Marc Davis drawings. And I used to trace those drawings as a little kid, and it helped teach me how to draw. So when I saw his drawings, which are next level, I lost my mind because I'm like, that's the guy. All that to say, I was still in community college before I went to CalArts, and I had a paper to write on an artist, and so I thought, well, I'd like to write one on Marc. I don't know him. I don't know how to get in touch with him. He's kind of sort of famous. I just thought, I'll send a letter up to the Disney studio cold and ask him to forward it to him, and I thought, it'll never get to him. But not only did it get to him, he actually wrote back and said, my wife Alice and I would love to meet you. You sound like a nice young man. So you come up. So my dad and I got in our car, and we drove up to Los Angeles, and that's me. So my dad took this photo. I was spending the day with him. And I just became like lifelong friends with him and his wife Alice, and they fed me when I was starving at CalArts, and it was so amazing because I was able to go visit them and say, hey, can I come down and have lunch with you and tell me about doing the Enchanted Tiki Room? Interestingly enough, my co-author, Pete Docter, who basically runs Pixar now, he was an upperclassman at CalArts when I was a freshman. And he was doing the same thing with Marc and Alice, but asking Marc about animating Maleficent or Cruella de Vil. So there was a similar thing. So that's why we put this book out. It is an attempt to recreate what it was like for Pete and I to visit with them, sit on their couch, and say, hey, tell us about the 1964 New York World's Fair where you did It's a Small World in 10 months from concept to opening, which is crazy pants, folks. All right, so this is an amazing photo for me. This is at WED, which is what they used to call Walt Disney Imagineering. That's on the patio right outside of the cafeteria. I had many breakfasts there. And when I started in the 90s, I did look like that. It was all chain link fences, part of an industrial park in Glendale. That's kind of the murderer's row of famous Imagineers, and Marc is in there, and I won't talk about everyone there, but there's some jaw-droppingly amazing Imagineers in that photo. But going back in time, Marc was an artist. He studied many, many places. He moved around quite a lot because his father moved around quite a lot as a young man, but he basically got hired in '37 and worked on Snow White. So this is him working with Grim Natwick, who was the supervising animator on The Prince and the Girl for Snow White. Marc was really good with anatomy, so he got a lot of the human characters, which was both a blessing and a curse. But that's him at the Hyperion Annex, believe it or not, animating on Snow White. A lot of these photos you're going to see, just because Pete and I were friends with Marc and Alice kind of turned over their whole house to us, and we found photos that were, squirreled away in closets and old boxes and things, and it just kind of jaw-dropping. And that's kind of one advice I have for people who are historians and want to do books. Don't just, if you're going to do a book on Disney history, don't just go to the Disney company. Go to collectors, go to people's houses, go to antique shops, go to auction houses, look for unusual things and try and think outside the box. But Alice had a lot of great stuff. So anyway, what's interesting about Disneyland design is Walt still had a lot of his animators, he'd pull them occasionally. So they'd be working on a film. And this is the earliest thing that I found that Marc worked on. Marc did the oleo, or the backdrop canvas, for the Golden Horseshoe Review in 1955. And as was wont with a lot of the animators, about a week before Disneyland opens, and I did key this whole talk to Disneyland-centric attractions because it is Disneyland's 70th anniversary this year, and because Chris asked me to, so kind of appropriate. But about a week before Disneyland opens, Walt throws this pre-opening party, which is also a wedding anniversary for he and his wife. And they got the train working, and they got the Mark Twain working, and had kind of a big, fun, somewhat drunken party at the Golden Horseshoe. So Marc took these photos. That's Ward Kimball up there on the left. And then Marc took these photos too. Look at the dirt. Again, this is about a week and a half before Disneyland opens, folks. Amazing. But let's talk about some of Marc's design. So I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 different shows he did at Disneyland here in Anaheim, and he was kind of a key designer of. Marc did not design the original Jungle Cruise, but he came in the 60s and redid a lot of the original Harper Goff designs, and he kept adding to the Jungle Cruise throughout the 60s and 70s, and also through the Florida versions and the Tokyo versions. So this is him in his office in the 70s. He just was a master of staging and design. One of the very first things he did for Walt was he added this big sacred elephant bathing pool scene. And the thing that Marc did that really struck me, and I loved it as a Jungle Cruise skipper and even as a little kid, was he's designing these elephants based on real-world elephants with real-world anatomy, but he's giving them a slight caricature, you can see there's a little smile line. He's also got the elephants doing things that elephants maybe wouldn't normally do, like rolling on their back like your puppy does when he's too excited, or playing around playfully. So it's giving that whimsical touch to things. These little baby elephants are super cute. And then he actually started doing, because he was an animator, animation breakdown patterns for the guys in the machine shop who actually built these figures. You don't think about this. This is something that engineering and people actually have to build and figure out the animatronics. And there's that's why I said when Chris made my fat head fatter about the castle walkthrough, it wasn't just me. It was Tony Baxter and a whole host of artists and technicians and lighting designers and audio people and special effects people who did that. So it takes, the theme park design is not one person, although you'll come away from this presentation thinking Marc did everything, but it takes so many people to do this kind of work, and most of whom go unsung, right? Another reason I do these books is to kind of maybe let you know about people you haven't heard about before who did some amazing work. So there's Walt backstage with this mother elephant that Marc designed and a baby elephant, and again, you can really see clearly, look at the caricature on her face. Those little smile lines. So next time you go through the Jungle Cruise, take a look at it. You see kind of the fun staging, and here we go. Oh, actually, here, I'll start it over again. I want to key this up. So when I was doing this book at Imagineering, we found they had a lot of old film footage, and they had a lot of old VHS cassettes which were rotting and falling apart. And I'm like, gosh, let's get these digital right now. But Marc came in the late 70s and throughout the 80s and gave design lectures to the people at Imagineering, which is a rare thing, so they videotaped them. So this is great because you're actually going to hear Marc talking about the elephants, and I've got a couple of clips in here. He's a little hard to hear. I might go turn it up a little bit, but this is Marc talking about his designs for the elephants.
Next thing I worked on was the Jungle River ride. I think, well, after Lincoln and a few other things in between, I did some work on Nature's Wonderland. I did some kind of a rehab on the sub ride and so on. But this was really kind of the first big kind of job of Walt. So anyway, did the elephant pool, and these are little explorations of things, again, something that an elephant, our elephants could do that you wouldn't see with a real elephant. And matter of fact, I remember somebody went through there one day and a couple of elderly ladies said, well, you can tell me that big elephants aren't real, but those little elephants are real. But we have them doing things, like 2 sprays out of the trunk and so forth and so on. Anyway, this was a very interesting thing that happened because I designed this pool. Blaine Gibson is magnificent sculptors, maquettes of these things. We put it all together. And then one day we went down there to see the thing. God, I took a look at this, and there were so many elephants in that pool. And I thought, because again, knowing Walt Disney and he was such a bear on how you stage something, things being staged right, things telling their story properly. And the first thing I said to him, I said, well, there's one thing you're probably not going to like, Walt, I said, that nobody can go through here and see all these elephants in one time. He said, and this again is how things begin to happen. He said, God, that's great. He says, so the next time they come through, they'll see something they didn't the second time.
So that's a really great point that he makes. And when you go through something like the Jungle Cruise or even Pirates of the Caribbean, there's so much to see, so much going on. It can be overwhelming, but it's really great because you go back a second, third, or 100th time, as the case may be. You're going to see something new every time. I think that has a lot to do with why these attractions are still so popular today. Also, the thing that's really important is clear staging and a clear read. So when you see a lot of these gags and these setups, Marc was kind of a master at having something read really well. And what I mean by when I say the word read, and I say this to a lot of younger designers I work with, is in a theme park attraction, especially in dark rides, you literally have seconds most of the time to see something, have it register, know what it is, and move on to the next one because your vehicle is not stopping. So you don't have time for a lengthy play, you don't have time for a lengthy soliloquy or people talking, you know, you have to see the thing, it has to be staged well, you have to get it because you're moving on right to the next thing. So Marc was really great at that. I try to do that in the shows I work on. That was a gorilla family that Marc had proposed in the 60s for Anaheim's Jungle Cruise. Prior to that, they had these kind of, I'm going to say, dippy gorillas at the end of the ride there. They didn't do too much, and they looked kind of taxidermy. They just kind of went kind of up and down. Not great. So Marc was trying to come up with something better. That was a sketch of what it looked like. And then he's trying to basically take the basic tenets of anatomy and you know, make them relate to how like a lowland mountain gorilla actually would look and what kind of some of the key poses would be. And this is really interesting. So I remember seeing this as a little kid. The idea behind this, if it's not clear, was this gorilla is punching at this crocodile, hits it in the head, and its butt flies up with its tail in the air. It's pretty funny. Again, that's really clear staging. The problem is, and Marc admitted this, he said this was a terrible idea because they couldn't do the machinery fast enough in the 60s to make this work. That said, they tried. This is a plan view of the Florida Jungle Cruise that they tried it for initially in the early 70s. And this is the sculpture. They're wonderful sculptors. And again, in all my books, I try and talk about some of these secondary and tertiary Imagineers you may not have heard of. So Joe Cava was an amazing sculptor who worked under Blaine Gibson. So he did a lot of the sculpture work at the studio. And this is the kind of rocky outcropping that they planned to have it in for a Walt Disney World. They never actually installed it. And the reason they didn't install it, I worked with a man who was the machinist for this on Tokyo Disney Sea, and he said, I tried, he said, we tried, we abandoned it at the last minute because we just couldn't get that gorilla to punch fast. We didn't have actuators that worked that fast then. But by the time they get to the 70s rehab for the Jungle Cruise here in Anaheim, they think, well, maybe we can make it work. So they built this rocky outcropping. That's the steel armature underneath, and there's the rock work. The rock work's still there today. I forget what gag is there today. I haven't been on the attraction in forever. Bananas, bunch of bananas, okay. And then this is it in the 70s, so I saw this when I was a little kid, but they never really got the punching working. It just was kind of like a weird sweeping motion. That was the best they could do. So Marc kind of considered this a failure. I didn't, because I think it's posed so well. You see it and it's kind of funny and cute, and you move on to the next thing. And then some of the other gorilla gags from this family, this mother gorilla and her baby, these all end up, Marc came up with an idea for a gorilla camp. Basically the idea is that the people out on safari are out in the jungle somewhere, so the gorillas have come in and taken over and they're trying on all their clothes and they're getting into everything and turning everything over. So the mother gorilla is there with her baby, and there's famously one who's got a big shotgun he's holding upside down and aiming at his face. I don't think this is there anymore. I think they pulled this out, but I think it's really funny still. Marc was a master at this kind of stuff. So again, I think Joe Cava might have done these sculpts as well. And then this is how it looked staging at the end of the day. Really, really cool. So Marc was this amazing designer. And then this is about the area that we're going to look at next. So back in 1955, when they opened the Jungle Cruise, which was designed by Harper Goff in '55. Marc was still an animator then. He didn't come to do Disneyland work till like the early 60s. Back in this area, they had a couple of giraffes and a lion, and these were all made by a man named Bob Matty in the machine shop. And Bob is kind of most famous for doing the squid from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and also did the shark in Jaws in the 70s, among many other things. But this is where they had it, and they were not great looking. I mean, for the 50s they were good, but they were learning the hard way when they opened Disneyland. A lot of these things, you know, these animatronics, or these, I wouldn't even call these animatronics, I would call these primitive mechanical figures, because they did very simple movements. They didn't do too well outside in the elements, and there's ways to deal with that now, but they didn't know then. So Marc came in and thought, well, that doesn't work too well, but what if we did a whole scene with like a whole lion velt, like we're going to Africa? So these are these African velt studies, and they're just beautiful watercolors. I love drawing with pen and ink. I'm a Luddite. I still draw by hand. And I love using ink pens, and Marc was really, really good at this. And this was a quick way for him to get his ideas down on paper and then just take watercolors, but they're very evocative. So these are some of the designs of the African veldt, and that scene is still there, although a little bit different than what I'm about to show. Early on, when they opened it, they had a pack of lions that were basically feasting on a zebra with some hyenas laughing. And there were, the women were fighting over the zebra legs, and then you had one point where a father lion rose up with a kind of gruesome zebra lion leg in its mouth. So they did this, they built it out there. You know, strangely, I feel like last night I was polishing this up. I didn't put the trapped safari, and I don't know why I left the trapped safari out of this, because that's like the most famous gag in this show, but that's all I've got for it right now, I apologize. But for those who don't know what I'm talking about, this is the bit in the ride where the rhinoceros has got the guys up the tree and he's hitting them up the butt with his point. So just the interesting thing about that is Marc came up with that as an idea, as an advertisement for the train, that people would see just on the train as an advertisement for the Jungle Cruise. And Walt saw it and said, oh, that gag's too good. You got to put it in the ride. So that's how that ended up there. But the lion veldt basically happened. They went to models. This is in the 800 Sonora facility in Glendale. This is the first place they moved when the Imagineers were kicked off the studio lot. So they worked in there and made this. These are some of the plan views of it. And then these are photos that Marc took while they were installing the rockwork. This is the very first thing that Marc designed that they actually built. He said he was terrified because all he did, he said, you know, I sat on my butt as an animator all these years. And you know, now he's directing people with backhoes and bulldozers like in the field. It's a big deal, and he's terrified he's going to screw up and do the wrong thing. These are more photos Marc took in the shop while they were sculpting, including George Snowden, who was an amazing sculptor as well. So sculpting these new animals for this whole scene. And then they built them at the studio and other shops around town in Los Angeles, and then they brought them in by crane and dropped them in. It's kind of fun to, like, you know, this is the first day they had it all staged, so of course Walt went down, and there's a lot of photos. It's kind of fun. You can do like a little animation back and forth with Walt. Yes, I don't get out much, ladies and gentlemen. So this roaring father lion over the zebra kill they built, but again, you can see these outdoor, you know, they did something, they had, I believe it's called Duraflex, so they were playing with a lot of plastic and silicone-based materials to get that kind of stretch on the opening, closing of the mouths of the lions. But these things didn't last too long out in the elements in the hot California sun, and you can see just after a few years the mouth is drooping and hanging down, not doing too well. So by the mid-'70s, Marc redesigns it with a whole new scene that's there today in kind of a cave. So you see the cave is not just there as part of the scene, it's actually to help protect the figures so they're getting less of the elements on them when you look at that. So there's a lot of thought and trial and error that goes behind theme park design that a lot of people maybe you don't necessarily see or think about when you're riding these rides. So this is amazing. I put some jungle sound effects on it. This film that they found, this video that they found, has no audio on it. But this is Marc in the 70s down in the field. And that's Wathel Rogers and Fred Jerger, who did a lot of work in the machine shop, at the studio, and the model shop. So they're kind of famous Imagineers. But this is Marc. It's so funny because we used to visit him, like, you know, like that hat and that coat was like hanging in their, you know, right outside their door on their coat rack. But this is kind of fun because Marc is like staging the props. Like, you know, he like went down there. I can just see him like grumbling, oh, this doesn't go here. Let's move this pot over here, as I say. For some reason, he used the phrase "as I say" like over and over again. I never heard anyone say that before or since, but that's, when I think of him, I think, as I say. Yeah. And, you know, this whole scene isn't there anymore, probably because of the guns, but it's really well staged and really well done. It's a big part of my childhood. It was very funny. And someone at our table before was saying Marc Davis really brought a lot of the humor to Disneyland, and he absolutely did. That was one of the big things that was missing from Disneyland in its early days was humor, and Marc was kind of a master at that. All right, that's enough of that. So I mentioned 800 Sonora. So Imagineering, when it first started in the early 50s, It was originally called not Walt Disney Productions. Now this is terrible because I have a book on Disneyland. I should know this. Anyway, they changed the name to WED, which is an acronym for Walter Elias Disney. But Walt started his own company on the lot where he already had another company. And there's kind of a conflict of interest, basically, to have all these Imagineers working on the studio lot. The shareholders weren't too happy about it. So basically, he had to get all his Imagineers off the studio lot. So the place that they found was an industrial park in Glendale, which is where Imagineering is today. The big headquarters is 1401 Flower Street, but on the corner of it, there's this smaller building called 800 Sonora. Alice Davis, Mark's wife, told me they called it the Pancake House because they thought it looked like an IHOP with that A-frame. And they would call and say, "Are you guys open?" And like, no. This is inside 800 Sonora. These are these amazing photos. Some of these I found at the Library of Congress, if you can believe it or not. So when it comes to thinking outside the box and looking for things that people haven't seen before, just my process on this was, I was looking at old magazines. I was looking at old magazines on the World Fair. I don't know if any of you remember Look magazine. Look magazine had a whole article in 1964 on the World's Fair, and it had all these photos, and they weren't the typical photos that you see of like, you know, you'll see someone on a film set, and you can tell, they said, "Hey, pose, pretend you're acting like you're working on this thing," and they go, like that. These photos looked like they were really working to me, and I was kind of amazed. So I thought, okay, well, Look magazine isn't around anymore. Where is it? It had gone bankrupt. Who ended up with the assets of Look magazine? Because I want to find out who the photographer was and where the outtakes were. Come to find out, it ends up at the Library of Congress. You go on the Library of Congress's website. They don't have any of these images. What they have is a big list of items that, you know, a line item list of what they have. But the description on the line items, they were somewhat vague, but they were enough that I thought there was something there. So then I went to my publisher at Disney and begged her. I said, "We have to pay for them to like send us like little contact sheets of these, but I have a feeling there's really great photos in here." Somehow I talked her into it. She did hundreds of photos of them at work, like just like photos that Disney doesn't own, that doesn't have. It's pretty amazing stuff. These are behind the scenes. That's Harriet Burns and Joyce Carlson. They are doing figure finishing on the Tiki Room birds in 800 Sonora. And that's a really highly skilled job, hand feathering one by one. And Harriet, I got to work with a little bit on the castle walkthrough at the end of her career. She's a really sweet one. She's one of the first women Imagineers to be hired. Amazing woman. But back to Mark's artwork. So this is some of Mark's artwork for the Enchanted Tiki Room. And it's just really, really charming. And you can just see the appeal. Again, he's doing the same thing he did with the Jungle Cruise, where he's adding it's all based in real anatomy and real animals, but he's adding a lifelike caricature to them. So the way Mark starts and the way Mark kind of told me to start, and I do, is just, you know, if I'm working on a show or something, especially with characters, I'll do a lot of thumbnail rough sketches, just real small sketches. And I'll start to figure out little posing. And it's just kind of a quick way to figure out, do I like this, do I not? And you can see he's circled some of these birds that he likes. And then he takes them into full-blown watercolors, which are just, you know, gorgeous and evocative. And again, you know, he knew that the birds were going to sing, so these are basically built to appeal to Walt, because Walt's going to make the decision, do this or don't do that, right? Super, super charming stuff. I could look at these all day. And then he kind of goes off kilter and does a bunch of weird, wacky, strange birds. You know, a bird with a bunch of martini olives for its head, or an Al Jolson bird, or a very strange, you know. And Mark said, well, he said, you know, I was just playing with stuff. I was trying some different things, but and they didn't really pan out. But he said, you know, you've got to kind of like, you know, look around different corners and see if you can come up with something different, even if you don't use it. It might add to it.
So the thing was that we began to, or at least I began to form a kind of my own philosophy of what an audio-animatronic show was in a park such as Disneyland or Disney World, or the same would be in Tokyo. One thing, nobody wants to stay in one attraction very long. And not staying in one attraction very long, you want to give a lot of show in a very short space of time. But what we really found, what I found here, was this show is built of a series of surprises. You do not know what's going to happen. You go in there and there's some birds, and I would say you can certainly assume that the birds are going to come to life. It's pretty obvious that they would. And they go through their little bit, and And then things begin to happen. The fountain comes to life, and it moves to music. The lighting is so important in this. And I may not have the things in exact order, but when these big bowls that hold the flowers come down, and the flowers begin to sing, and then the kind of key flowers come up and sing solo. Again, it's a surprise. It's what you did not expect to see. And then finally the ceiling opens up and this birdmobile comes down. And then finally the whole room comes to life. Now this is, to me, this is the most exciting part of the show, is when this, I guess it's the Hawaiian war dance, comes on and black the room out and lightning flashes, and then even the wall decorations come to life. The poles that are holding up the building come to life. And I think this is really the extraordinary thing. Now this was the first sketch I think I did when we were only going to have maybe 2 heads on these. Then we finally ended up with 3 heads, and this was a more or less a finished sketch that I did. And these are based on New Guinea art. The only thing is that I have taken a lot of liberties with it.
He absolutely did, but the thing that's interesting about Mark and Alice is that they were big fans of Papua New Guinea architecture, art, and design. They went to Papua New Guinea many, many times and collected artifacts. Their house was like a museum of this stuff. It was incredible. So Mark kind of knew what he was talking about. So he really pushed the oceanic design of this, which I've always loved. I know Chris is a big fan of. These are some of his rough sketches of the birdmobile, as he says, coming down, and the poles. Again, so this is all based on Polynesian South Seas tikis, not Florida tikis. There is a difference, folks, but Polynesian tikis. And so these kind of have a Disney look to them, and they're fun. And it's interesting. If you ever go to Disneyland, the neat thing, but the ops hates it, is you can touch all these poles as you go sit down, and you see their little human figures, and they've actually got little butts on their backside. So you can actually you can reach around and feel their butts on the backside of the thing, if you're so inclined. In the research, this is interesting too. A lot of the documentation of sculpting these things was done on Polaroids in the 60s and 70s. These Polaroids are disintegrating, and basically the emulsion is leaching out, and so they're going away. But this is, I kind of flipped out when I saw this, because this is Rolly Crump sculpting one of those tiki poles. Rolly, who was a good friend of mine, and his son is one of my best friends and was my manager at Disney for years. Rolly sculpted all these. He went to Blaine Gibson and he said, hey, I designed some of these tiki gods in the lanai outside, and Mark did the poles, and he said, who's going to sculpt them? Or he said, are you going to sculpt them, Blaine? And Blaine's like, no, I'm too busy. I don't have enough time. And he goes, well, who's going to sculpt them? And he goes, you are. And he's like, me? He's like, I've never sculpted anything in my life. But he did, and he got a couple other people to help, like Colin Campbell. But it was so cold in 800 Sonora, he had to take the clay out to the parking lot to get it to soften up a little bit in the sun. And he actually used plastic sporks. Everyone remember the spork? Sporks from the cafeteria to carve. So next time you're in the lanai, look at some of those tiki gods. Those little hatch lines on the wood there. Those are all from a spork in the Imagineering cafeteria. Here they are the day they opened the show, and again, I just love this photo of Walt, and the company hates me putting it because they don't like people doing this, but I did this as a little kid. I don't know if any of you ever did this. And you can touch these things, Generally, you design things you don't want people to be able to touch them because they can break them, but anyway, it's cute. And then it's interesting, Mark's original design for the drumming tikis that are up on the soffit, all in the 4 corners of the room, those guys on the ends, they're actually supposed to be monkeys. And they had tails attached to them, but when it came time for Rolly to sculpt them, he lost the tails and stylized them quite a bit more. And then the other thing he added right at the very last minute, I don't know if you can see in the photo, he added little flat metallic discs. Did anybody remember the Sparklets water trucks that used to go by? And they had like a wall of like shimmering little discs on the back. He basically used little discs. He probably got it at a craft shop, Joann's Fabrics or something. But he put those, he said, it just needed a little something to give that extra zhuzh to push it over the top. So it's interesting. What's that?
Pilots.
Pilots? Pilots, I'm being told. I'm sure that's right. These are some more of these shots that are just informal. Again, it's amazing. I mean, there's, Blaine Gibson and Yale Gracie, Roger Broggie, Dick Irvine, and Mark. So I won't bore you with the story of all these men, but they're all famous Imagineers who did incredible things for Walt. But they're all at work. You can tell Walt is talking to them about it. They're not posing. Fun little sidebar fact was when they went to do the New York World's Fair, if taking on 4 shows wasn't enough, they tried to do a 5th show. They tried to talk Coca-Cola into doing a version of the Enchanted Tiki Room, a show that they retooled called Legends of the Enchanted Tiki. They pitched it to them, but they thought, the way they laid out the theater in Anaheim, they kind of felt like it didn't really work too well. I think it works great, frankly. But the way you're cross-seated and you're looking in one bay in one section and another, they thought, let's do like a traditional theater version of this with a stage. So Mark designed a stage for all the tiki gods that are in the lanai in the middle of the show, and then the whole thing would go red and explode and have evil volcanoes and things like that. But Coca-Cola did not go for it, so this thing didn't happen. But here's another soft drink company that did go for something. It's a Small World at the New York World's Fair. So again, I'm talking about this because it does come to Disneyland. This is one of the many genius things about Walt Disney is the 1964 New York World's Fair was this amazing proving ground for new animatronic technology. But the real genius thing that Walt Disney did was he designed 4 high-end experimental shows that he got other companies to pay for and brought back to Disneyland at no cost to himself. Genius. Genius. Anyway, that's how it looked at the New York World's Fair, and that big, tall structure in the middle, that's a big sculpture that Rolly Crump designed called the Tower of the Four Winds, and we'll see that again in a second here. But one of the most popular shows in New York, they went from concept to opening in something like 11 months, and guys, that's crazy pants. You do not design and open something in that time frame. This is, again, an 800 Sonora. That's Dick Irvine. Dick Irvine kind of ran WED/Imagineering. He was kind of the Marty Sklar of his day before Marty took over. You can see Harriet in the background there, back by that little vending machine. It's a very small space. And then this is on the studio. So that's Mark on the left, Walt Disney. And then the woman on the right, that's Mary Blair. Mary Blair is one of the most jaw-droppingly, amazingly talented designers and colorists just in the history of ever, not just in Disney. She was incredible. And it was really great because Mark was friends with her. She actually worked in animation going back to the late 30s, early 40s. So a lot of the films like Saludos Amigos or So Dear to My Heart up to, Song of the South, Lady and the Tramp, Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland. She set the color styling for a lot of these animated films. And so when they did It's a Small World, it's kind of interesting because when they started, this was a super fast-track project. But when they started, Mark tries to basically start designing the show the way he would design it himself with cute little kids. They had the conceit, well, these are children from around the world. They're going to be singing. We're going to have the Sherman Brothers come up with a song that you'll never get out of your head. Fine. But Mark starts doing these designs, and to me, it's very evocative of something very stylized, like Mary Blair would do. I felt like he's kind of trying to ape what Mary Blair would do here. And as much as I love Mark, it's not as good and sophisticated as what Mary would do. And then they started doing rough massing models in the model shop out of paper, which is something we do digitally now mostly, although I'm still a big fan of traditional handmade models because that's kind of what I was trained in, and I still think there's no substitute for that. We do a lot of this virtually in the computer now. But these are kind of white massing models. That's Claude Coates working with Mark. He was on this for a short time. Claude Coates was also an amazing Imagineer and designer who did many, many Disneyland attractions. I'm a big fan of his. And they got paired up on Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean later. But Claude starts doing these rough paper model approaches, and Mark is doing these little small sketches that are very stylized, trying to ape Mary. And then Marc did a couple, I'm gonna say like well over 100. These are all stenographer pads that we found like in a shoebox, and there's like 100 of them. And what's amazing about these, they're real small. They're like, I don't know, they're like 4 inches by 3 inches or something. And they're all done with ink pen and just really quick, but what's fascinating to me about them is a bunch of them you can start to see some of the gags that actually end up in the final show. So all these ones here on this slide end up including the idea that in the Scottish section there's like a tartan fabric pattern that becomes the hillside, singing geese, the little Dutch children with their clicking shoes, the dancing leprechaun, these all make it into the show. They start doing more stylized little, almost like slices of scenes, aspirational of what it could look like. These are all evocative of Mary to me, but eventually they stop horsing around and they hire Mary and they bring her in. So Mary was actually not based in Southern California at this time in the 60s. She was living in Great Neck, New York, doing a lot of advertising illustrations for a lot of different companies. And you can find a lot of that stuff I don't know, she did cigarette advertisements and children's books and all kinds of stuff. So she would do these designs and she would mail them from New York to Glendale. What's amazing about Mary, obviously her color palette is super sophisticated, but she also used just like wacky materials. She would hand paint this stuff, but she would take like a linoleum sample, or she would take like a wallpaper sample, or she would take like a theatrical lighting gel and like lay it down on top of it. And it's kind of frustrating because the original artwork, like in the Imagineering archives, a lot of that stuff she just kind of glued down and it gets loose and it kind of like you take it out and like it's falling apart and you got to figure out like where it's supposed to go. But she was an incredible designer. Marc said she was one of the few artists that actually like made Walt change his opinion about artwork, and I think she's up there with Matisse. I mean, she's just really, really next level. This is also an 800 Sonora. As part of the ride, there's a lot of little children's toys, and it's a small world. So Marc designed all the toys, and Rolly Crump got the job of building the toys. So this is Marc pitching all his ideas to Walt in 800 Sonora. And there's Roger Brogy looking not too happy about how he's going to figure out the mechanics on this. And then they've got all of Mary Blair's artwork as inspiration up on the wall there. The model was kind of amazing too. I mean, this is like, they also did theatrical lighting on this model, which is a really unusual thing to do, especially in the 60s. The color is just, again, jaw-dropping Mary Blair color. So, the next time you go on It's a Small World, I don't know, like put cotton in your ears if you can't stand the song. I like the song actually. But the color and the design and the melding of what Marc Davis did with Mary Blair and what Rolly Crump did with the little mechanical toys is just gorgeous. This is the South America scene. I think some of this is gone now, unfortunately. But really beautiful design. And then this was really amazing to me. In my books, I'm trying to put you in the shop. I'm trying to put you in the where the designers are and what they're doing. So this was kind of interesting. This is a pencil sketch by Mary. That's the Eiffel Tower in the middle. That's how stylized she wanted to make it. But I noticed there was a piece of like onion skin or trace paper on the top, and it was kind of faded. But when I scanned it into Photoshop, I thought, oh, if I darken it up, maybe I can read, because she wrote something here. And it's a little note to Marc, and it's just basically talking about the staging and the color and the design. So this is the kind of thing that she would work on, and then she would pass it to Marc or leave it on his desk and say, think about this, and then maybe they'd talk about it the next day, or maybe not. Another thing that's kind of interesting and apocryphal is there's a lot that's made about Marc Davis and Claude Coates not liking each other and not working well together. I don't know where that rumor came from, but you hear it a lot online, and I try to rumor bust whenever I can. And this is proof. They were friends. I mean, they weren't best friends, but this is them all getting together at Marc and Alice's house in the 60s with Mary. All heavy smokers. And Alice, Marc's wife, Alice was a costume designer. And so she got the job to make all the beautiful, jaw-droppingly gorgeous costumes for all the dolls in It's a Small World. And Alice told me, she said, she got hired. She said, I was hired as a jobber, which means she was a contractor, right? But she got to go in. First of all, it was hard for her because everyone kind of looked at her with the stink eye because they thought nepotism, she's Marc's wife. But she really was obviously clearly talented enough to do this. Also got to work with Mary Blair, who was her longtime friend. But she was working on the dresses, and she said, I talked to Walt one day, and I said, Walt, now I'd like to know, what is my budget for doing these dresses? And she said, I knew I stepped in it because Walt looked at me and his eyebrow went up and he said, Alice, he said, I have a whole building full of bean counters and accountants who are there to tell me what I can't spend. He said, I don't want to hear that from you again. He said, I want you to make the most beautiful dresses that any little girl would absolutely die to play with. And that's what Alice did. So she was an amazing woman, loved her a lot. These are some of her drawings. So this is for the Middle East section, and you can see how these all kind of match up. She had a whole stack of these under their bar in their house. Just like, okay, Alice. This is their Hungarian dancer. This is kind of ridiculous, but also the amazing, like, you would never see the back of that figure. And here she is designing this incredibly intricate back to the dress. I mean, I actually would not let someone do that today because that's money down the toilet, but amazing, amazing designs. This is mocking up on the stage for dress rehearsal. So what was going on in the 60s and in the 50s, really, when they built Disneyland? They didn't really have anywhere to go with these things. They would use sound stages at the studio when they could, but they were doing films and things like that too. But mocking up these scenes at full size is a way to prove out how things are working. So they mocked up, they did basically the dress rehearsal of It's a Small World, and they took one of the boats and they put them up on wooden platforms on casters and pushed Walt and Marc and Mary and a bunch of the animators around and showed it to them. This is kind of interesting too. So the show was super successful at the World's Fair. I'm not going to go into the interior so much because I'm kind of talking about design tonight, but what's interesting is that big tower, the Four Winds that Rolly Crump designed that I showed you at the beginning of this, they actually were going to bring it to Disneyland. They were going to make it the focal point as you walk to the facade. And at the last minute, they crunched the numbers and they realized it was going to cost more than it cost to actually build the thing, to ship it back from New York. But they kind of set Rolly up because Rolly told me, he said, you know, one day I was heading into a meeting with Walt and they pulled me aside and they said, hey, Rolly, the Tower of the Four Winds, he said, we're not going to bring it back. And Rolly goes, oh, that's too bad. He goes, yeah, you're going to tell Walt in the meeting. This kind of thing happened to Rolly Crump all the time. But what's interesting about it is Mary Blair was, for the facade, you can see where she was going with the one at Disneyland. It was going to be all white, which it is currently, which I'm thankful for. And she used lighting gels, and the idea was that they were going to project different colors on it at night to come up with a very different, colorful look. Here's the model as Rolly finished it off, because unfortunately, very sadly, Walt kind of criticized Mary's take a couple times, and after about 3 times of Walt criticizing it, Mary got very hurt, and she just decided, well, I'm done with this, and flew back to New York and let Rolly finish it. So Rolly Crump ends up designing the facade in Mary's style. It's kind of sad. But this is 1966. They bring it to Disneyland. That's the president of Bank of America who was the sponsor on this at the time. So some of you may remember there used to be a whole Bank of America overlay thing in the 60s and 70s. And that is an amazing attraction. I still love it to this day. Fun fact, when I was a little kid, so in the 60s, my dad was a janitor at Disneyland. He worked the graveyard shift. And one night he got the booby prize of having to clean out all the trash in It's a Small World. And they had it set up, and Rolly confirmed this. For whatever reason, you couldn't have the work lights on without having the soundtrack playing. So my dad was stuck in there for 9 hours listening to that song. So as a little kid, I had the souvenir record. I was forbidden to play that as a little kid. All right. So that little 800 Sonora that I mentioned, it was too small. They were designing Jungle Cruise, Tiki Room, all 1964 World's Fair shows, and they were starting on Pirates of the Caribbean. Too small a space. They were growing. They were busting at the seams. They needed to move to a bigger space. So this is 1401 Flower Street in Glendale, where I worked for many years. The building still looks like that today. Basically, it was prior to Imagineering moving in, it was a cosmetics factory called Studio Girl Cosmetics. And when they moved in, the smell of the perfume was overwhelming that they took over. So everyone kind of moved in there. This is not dissimilar to how it still looks today. There was a sign on the corner that said Glamour Way. So they thought it would be funny to put their own sign that said Wed Way, which is what they called Imagineering at the time. Haha. Marc got his own office to himself, so this is him working on one of the most amazing shows of all time, Pirates of the Caribbean, just a real tour de force. And again, you know, I hate to say Marc did Pirates of the Caribbean because so many other people worked on it, so many other people contributed to it. Claude Coates did a lot of the set design for it and a lot of the staging. so many different disciplines that go into these things, but Marc is really responsible for the characters and the gags and the staging and the things that you remember. This is the 1401 model shop. Again, I spent many hours here, so it's kind of weird for me to look at all this and go, oh yeah, like I was back in that corner with Andrea painting things when I was 25. But this is Marc and Blaine showing the full-size figure to Walt, probably in 65 or so. But going back to the early 60s, or a few years before that, Walt asked Marc to look at this, and he said, hey, Marc, I'm thinking about doing this expansion to Disneyland. We're going to call it New Orleans Square. And as part of New Orleans Square, we're going to have retail and shops and restaurants. And I want to have this big, wonderful attraction. It's going to be a wax museum that you're going to walk through with a bunch of pirates in them. So Marc, I want you to start thinking about pirates and coming up with some ideas for pirates. So this was in Marc's desk drawer in his office. And in one of these pads, I think is the first mention of the phrase, dead men tell no tales, which is kind of interesting. But what Marc was doing here was Marc was doing research, pulling out books from the library about historical pirates, just to kind of do some research and kind of figure out what did pirates do? What are interesting about pirates? What are interesting characters? And how could I take some of those ideas? Because obviously there are no photos of pirates, right? So what he starts doing is he starts taking some of these famous pirates and assigning just character sketches to them. What could they have looked like? Bless you. What could they have looked like? What could they have done? Here's some little factoids about them. So he starts doing these character sketches. And then this is kind of funny. I do not begrudge anyone copying an idea they get from somewhere, but this was kind of funny because I was going through the Imagineering library and I was looking at, I was trying to find books that Marc checked out for pirates because his name would be in the slot, in the little checkout card. And this is one, this book I think is from, what's it from? What does it say? 1859. It's called Pirate's Own Book, but there's all these line cuts. But anyway, I found this drawing in here. I was like, okay, Marc. I wish he'd still been around when I would have loved to show him that, but anyway, very funny. This is the Wax Museum layout. There were a couple of different layouts they did as it worked over time, but what's interesting about it is a lot of the scenes really get morphed into scenes in the ride when they do the ride later on. But the idea was you would come down a flight of stairs, walk through, you'd stand in front of a little vignette, a light would come on, maybe there'd be some simple animation and the pirate would do a little thing, and then you'd move on to the next thing. That was the idea. And you can see a lot of these little gags and ideas, they kind of sort of end up in the show later when it becomes a ride. Some of these illustrations, the ones that I mentioned that are in that souvenir guidebook that I traced as a little kid, these are some of them. So when I saw the originals for these, I lost my mind because I'm like, this is one of my earliest childhood memories is sitting on the floor and tracing these things. The other thing that's interesting is, when we did this book, there was a lot of hubbub about the auction scene and basically, selling women into slavery for pirates. And it's probably good that they took a look at it. But, they got this bad rap saying, well, they were not pro-women at all. And Marc actually had female pirates he was trying to be as part of his show. They just didn't make the cut for whatever reason. So that's Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who have a really interesting storied history as female pirates and basically kicking butt as female pirates. But the other interesting thing about this is another drawing of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and I'm always fascinated to see, I try to retcon, how did they come to a design or a classic gag or something. So look at the skeletons in this artwork and see if that looks familiar to you, because that is basically, that's what they do in the cave section. And the funny thing about the cave section is, when they do end up going to a boat ride later, that whole area, that whole first area where all the skeletons are, that's where the Wax Museum was going to go. And Walt realized, I want to do a much bigger show. So the second show building actually goes outside the berm. So in the ride when you're going in this really long hallway and it's going, dead men tell no tales, that's actually a long corridor to get you outside underneath the train tracks into what used to be part of the parking lot, into the second show building where all the big stuff happens, where they're fighting the pirate ship and all the show scenes. Then you come back around and then you do that lift up back. That's getting you back over the train tracks and back into the park. But so when it came to doing that first section, they didn't have anything planned for it because that's where the Wax Museum was going to go. And Marc and Claude Coates went to Walt and said, well, what do you want to put down there now that the main show is outside the berm? And he goes, I don't know, just put some skeletons and stuff in there. So that's what they did. It's funny though, because it kind of serves as like the perfect, it's like a design amuse-bouche, right? It's like this perfect little palate cleanser before you get into the main show, I think. So it works much better than Florida's show where you go right into the action. These are more character designs. That's, I think, Sir Henry Morgan. I just like that because it's got dramatic uplighting. They didn't do this gag, but it was planned for one part in the ride we'll see in a second. And then these are all Wax Museum rough sketches. Ken O'Connor was also an animator at the studio. He was Marc's assistant. And he was tasked with taking a bunch of these, basically these gag drawings that Marc did and trying to shove them into all one big tableau, right? So all these gags here are all shoved into that one scene that you were gonna stand in front of and see. They didn't do it. But they did try to do the shadow gag. This is an early 1/4-inch scale paper model I found some negatives of. And in the boat ride, you can see on the wall there, that's where they were going to put that Sir Henry Morgan, that dramatic uplighting with that shadow. Now, it's kind of a good idea that they didn't, because when you come into the scene, you're really looking at the pirate ship bombing the fort. That's really where your focus is and should be, not looking to the right. But they did have it planned for that big blank. So next time you ride Pirates, look to the right and you see that big blank wall. That's where that was going to go. Yes, I'm a nerd. This is Bill Justice, who is also a longtime animator, and he came to WED in the 60s as well. They did a bunch of filming of live action performers. So I forget this man's name. He did a lot of live action for Sleeping Beauty posing too, but he's posing as the captain of the ship now. And what's interesting is you can see they've got Marc's drawing like on an easel. It's reversed here. It's that drawing there. So they're using film footage to basically come up with the key posing for the animation. And where they did some of the first animation is actually at Imagineering in the high bays in 1401. The way they did animation at this time, crazy, this thing called scalloped discs. And without boring you to tears, which may be too late at this point, they had these vinyl record-sized discs that they cut little notches out of. And as these discs rotated, every one was one function. So cutting the notches out and the needle would come and go, you'd get like an arm just going up and down. And then another one would be maybe a wrist turning back and forth. And maybe another one would be a finger coming out. So when you start putting these things all together, you start getting a fluid human motion. A really painfully, basically labor-intensive way to do this, because if they didn't get the motion the way they wanted, or if they cut too deep on the disc, then they had to add tape back in and like build it back up. It was a giant pain in the butt. But they're mocking this up at Imagineering in the high bays, and the reason I know that these are the high bays is because the Frozen e-ticket I worked on for Tokyo, we did the whole model in here, and I was looking up at the ceiling at all the gack in the ceiling and all the HVAC and the heaters, and I was like, that looks familiar. And I was able to take these drawings and go, oh, this was done exactly here because all that junk in the ceiling is still there at Imagineering. So it's just another way to think outside the box. Anyway, they mocked up this whole auction scene. This is one of the last things that Walt saw before he died. So he dies in early December '66. So he came to Imagineering one last time and saw these mock-ups. And you can see that they haven't made the animals yet. They're still painted flats, but they've got a lot of early versions of the figures, and Walt approved and bought off on this. And then they're projecting some of that animation there, so interesting to see. Also, mocking up the boats. Aero Development, a lot of people aren't familiar with them, but they designed a lot of the vehicles at Disneyland, and they did the boats for It's a Small World. And so when they were at the 64 fair, they realized, okay, that boat system, that moves a lot of people through a space in in a good amount of time, which is always an issue with attractions. You want to move a lot of people through it a lot, so more people go through and see the show, the more people are happy, is what it comes down to, especially with how expensive theme parks are. So this is up at Mountain View, California. Aero Development was based up there, and they did the boats. And so, but the big difference between Pirates and Small World was they had a couple of drops that Walt wanted to do. So these are testing out the drops up there. I love these photos because these actually came from one of the men who started Aero Development's son, who took some of these. So that's Walt with a bunch of the Imagineers, and Marc's in the back there. But here they are coming down the drop, and you can see in the back there, Marc is just popping out behind Claude Coates, who's wearing a checkered sport jacket. And then in Marc's photos, I found a photo Marc took over his shoulder as they're going down this drop. which is kind of fun. Now, this is, I'm breaking my law here. This is from Florida, but I'm showing this. This is the end of Pirates for Florida. They did a lot of different things in Pirates Florida that they felt they screwed up on here in Anaheim. I don't necessarily agree with that, but this ending had this whole scene basically with a treasure chamber where you kind of pulled up in your boat and you walked on out around the side. Oh, I'm running really late. I better hurry up. I'm sorry. Chris, keep going. Chris, give me the high sign when I need to blast through. I've probably got about another 15 minutes to go. Anyway, this whole end scene with all this treasure, Mark's going to talk a little bit about it, so let's go ahead and play that.
One thing that bothered me with the part right here was the fact that the ride was over at the bottom of that upright, and is over at the bottom of that. Then you have to go ratchety all the way to the top. Then you got a bunch of booths banging around. Then you wait, you wonder,
I'll try to go fast. I'll go fast.
well, what are we going to do next? Or when the hell are we going to get off of here? So what? And it takes that, to me, that great amusement of the attraction away from it. And so when we did the Florida one, I wanted to use a speed ramp to get people up, unload them at the bottom. So what I did was to do that scene, which turned out pretty much like this, a big treasury, an awful lot to see. And anyway, to do a parrot that could sing the song in its entirety, so you hear all the lyrics, and enough stuff to look at on the outside, and just nutty things here, and even to these figures, which are inside. And the reason they're the color that they are, I want everything inside of that room there to be gold. I want that one rich, everything gold. So I didn't use any cool colors on them. I used the khakis and the yellows and the golds and yellow rope and what have you. And I think there's an effectiveness in that, as I say again, it's making a complete visual statement. Something we can do perhaps better than anybody else.
So color theory is a big part of all this too. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to go fast just because I told Chris I'd do this in 45 minutes and I'm at 55 already. So 2 more shows. Disneyland I loved. Bear Band growing up. Country Bear Jamboree was planned for basically a wilderness park that Walt was going to do called Mineral King. And this was going to be a show that was going to be meant to keep people late afterward. So Mark started doing exploratory sketches of bears, and the kind of funny but also kind of sad story is the last time Mark saw Walt alive, Walt was visiting Imagineering. He had just gotten out of the hospital, and basically they'd removed one of his lungs because he was riddled with cancer from smoking his whole life. So he was not in great shape, but he wanted to visit with Mark, and he sat with Mark, and he said, Walt laughed harder than I ever saw him laugh at these drawings of these bears, and really loved them and thought they were really funny. And then Walt said, okay, I got to get back to the studio. And he said he stood up, he walked out of my office, and he said he got up a few steps out of my office, and he turned around and looked at me and he said, goodbye, Mark. And he said, the whole time I knew him since the 30s, he never said goodbye to me, like ever. He said, I'll see you next week, or we'll get together soon. And he said, I know he knew. And within a week and a half or so, he was gone. So, yeah. But these drawings are wonderful. They're basically exploratory sketches. And this is what I talk about, a clear pose and a clear read. Even though it's not fall down funny, there's something inherently humorous about what Mark is doing here. They're really masterful designs. This is at WED, working on some of the designs with Dick Irvine and Claude Coates and Exitencio. These are marching bears. He tried a bunch of different things, but they basically decided by the time they got to Florida, let's make them basically kind of like hillbillies, moonshine, early American country western, and that's what they did. And they ended up bringing the show to Disneyland, which I loved. Dorothea Redmond, who was absolutely jaw-droppingly wonderful. She worked on Gone with the Wind, did these beautiful watercolors of the theater. Mark did a bunch of the proscenium sketches, including this oil painting of the lead bear. And then I would say, and he would say, these and the America Sings characters really match Mark's designs dimensionally better than anyone ever did. And then also they hired Gagman Albertino. Albertino also came from animation. He was a storyboard artist. The guy was a riot. He boarded out the whole show and came up with a lot of the funnier parts of it. And Big Al is loosely based on him. He did storyboards for the whole show and would pitch people through it with Marc. Again, Big Al being one of the great moments of the Bear Man show, if you remember it.
In contrast to the Hall of Presidents, let's see how a somewhat less serious attraction is developed. Here, one of our artist designers sketches out the members of a troupe of rather unusual bear vaudevillians. This is Henry, the master of ceremonies. He heads up a down-home country music review. Now, the next step is to work out the routines of every act. Story sessions are held in which writers bounce ideas back and forth, and as part of the game, act out every part. This is Gomer playing a few bars to open the show. Now Henry takes the spotlight and says, "Howdy, folks, welcome to the show." Now we go back to Gomer for a solo on the music box. Any similarities between Gomer and our story man are coincidental? Here we see the magic of what we call audio animatronics. Of course, it isn't really magic. It's a skillful blending of imagination, electronics, and computer technology.
So here they've gotten away from the scallop discs and they've made a console, a board, which they made little pots. Each one of those little pots is a different movement. So every new show they added something different until they went to the computers.
Howdy there, Clarence. Welcome to the one, the only, the original Country Bear Review, featuring a bit of Americana, our musical heritage from the past.
We're going to cut that. Country Bear was a big show I love. This is the last bit I want to talk about. Marc did a lot of the designs for the Haunted Mansion, probably one of my favorite Disney shows of all time. He was a little frustrated with this show because he didn't have as much artistic control as he did on Pirates, partially because Walt wasn't with us anymore. Marc did a bunch of these exploratory sketches we found in his office, which are, again, funny. He's figuring out ghost gags. And I just want to show, like, with his designs, how closely, these are a bunch of shots taken open in year, and just how closely the figure finishing, the staging match his designs. The guy was a master at what he did. This whole party in the graveyard bit, I love that gag. Imagineering, I kept trying to bring that back and add that, pouring champagne into your slipper, I think is very funny. And then the idea that there are musicians in the graveyard, and even the owls up in the tree, he keeps as part of this. The idea that a hearse is stuck in the mud and there's a tea party going on, and then of course the hitchhiking ghost, which is one of the most famous gags of all time. It starts off, they have this tall, skinny ghost. They call him Ezra now. He becomes the tall one in here. But Ezra has an interesting history. Marc's playing with ideas for historical ghosts. This is one called the Phantom Drummer of Tedworth. And really, from here, you see the face. He starts turning into these explorations that Marc does, these monster ghosts. And the guy on the right ends up being one of the hitchhiking ghosts. But aside from the weird Bolshevik woman with the chicken feet and the bomb, there's a hunched over one with a top hat. And this hunched over one with this top hat, Marc comes up with this thing he calls the Hatbox Ghost. And so the Hatbox Ghost, the idea was that his head would disappear and reappear in the hat box and cycle back and forth. This was in the Children's Haunted Mansion record as a little kid, and it wasn't in the ride when I was a little kid, so I didn't even know if it was real. I tried for years to get them to bring this back. They eventually did. But this is Yale Gracie mocking it up. It actually was in the ride for a week or two. And then these are actually the heads. Son of the man who provided Yale with these still has the heads. I think that's actually a human head, the bottom one on the right there. These are kind of famous old WED advertising photos. I found these production photos. So this is how the Hatbox Ghost looked when they first built him. It's kind of interesting. He's supposed to be a creepy old man, and he's got a little cane, and you can see there's a cam at the bottom. He's supposed to be like an old man getting tremors, holding his cane, shaking. You'll see why that's a bad idea. This is probably the only known photo of the Hatbox Ghost in the ride in 1969 before they tore him out. And you can see the movement on that. It was such a bad pinch point that his hand's about to snap off. But you can also see why the gag didn't work and they pulled it. The idea was that they shone a black light on his head, and then turned it off, and then turned on a light inside a scrim-filled hat box to make it look like the head was going back and forth. But of course, you could see both heads at the same time. It didn't work. It was a terrible gag. So after a week or two, they tore it out, and they basically stripped him for parts. They actually made 2 Hatbox Ghosts, one for Florida, and we tried to find him, thought he might be in storage, but no such luck. Also, the idea of the evolution of the bride. Marc was obsessed. In the 60s, there were these Invisible Man model kits. You might remember them. And so he wanted to do an invisible ghost where you could see the brains and the hearts and all the guts and things. So he designs this woman with a little dog ghost. They VE the dog. They cut him out. And they make a little maquette. And the maquette gets kind of sinister looking and kind of stylized, not friendly like the other one. And then from there, when they go to production and make her, someone goes, well, let's put a veil on her and let's put a bouquet. This ghost was never designed as a bride, but there's this whole backstory about the bride and the Hatbox Ghost in the attic that they've played up endlessly. But like Marc never intended this figure as a bride. It's just someone put a bridal veil and flowers in her hand. So it's kind of interesting how that's all grown. And then the last thing I'll close with is Marc is really famous for doing the changing portraits and the stretching portraits. This is this little gallery. He wanted to make it look dangerous, like you were swallowed by like Jonah and the whale kind of a feel. But all those paintings he did are part of this. Some of this they didn't do. He wanted to do these gates entering into the portrait gallery, and they didn't do, but he liked it so much he actually had paid someone to make them for his living room, which is kind of funny. And then explorations like on real world ghosts, like, Rasputin, which Walt said, you can't do Rasputin, Marc, like some of his relatives might still be alive. And then these are all famous. These are all in the hallways. Medusa turning into a Gorgon, ship with lightning. These are all classic things. A woman turning into a panther. Here's the model. Woman aging from young to old. And then the stretching portraits, which again were these really, they've been parodied. They're in the cultural zeitgeist, right? Like they've been parodied so many times. And this is amazing to me and Pete. We found these rough sketches in his office. This is incredible. So this is basically the development of one of the stretching portraits. He's trying to come up with ideas. He's like, well, let's put let's put a woman from like the gay 90s on like a big old bicycle. Nah, that's not that funny. What if she's being scared by a mouse and we'll put her up on a chair? Well, that's kind of sort of funny, but I don't know. Maybe she's got her reflection, mirroring back. Well, that's not that funny, but what if we take her with the parasol and we put her on top of a building? Well, that's kind of more interesting, but it's still not funny. Let's put her in danger. Let's put a crocodile underneath her. That'll make it work. Yeah, I like that idea. I'm going to take that to a tight pencil. I love all this because this is how I work and a lot of people I know work. You're building on something, right? Like how do you come to something? So let's take it to pencil and let's take it to a nice watercolor, and then you've got this iconic thing. So let's close with hearing what Marc and Walt Disney have to say about this scene.
Marc, I want you to meet Julie Ream, Marc Davis. Julie is Miss Disneyland Tencennial, and Marc Davis is the master in charge of our House of Illusions, or what do we call it?
A haunted mansion.
Haunted mansion and supernatural.
Oh, lots of
Give you a little idea what we're going to have in there.
Yes, well, we're doing a lot of portraits that change right in front of your very eyes. As a matter of fact, one of our paintings here is based on Greek mythology. This is Medusa. It's a very beautiful girl. She offended the goddess Athena, and as a result, Athena turned her into a Gorgon. And as you may know, if you looked at a Gorgon would turn you into stone.
Well, we sure don't want that to happen. Tell her about this thing here, will you, Marc?
Well, this is our elongated...
They're clearly making this up as they go, by the
In
way.
this room, we also have some stretching portraits. Perhaps you'd like to look at those over there. These are some...
You pull them down, you should see what happens when the room gets longer, you get this full-size portrait. This is my favorite here.
Axe to the head.
Come on, let me get a picture here. Another picture right about there. You seen enough? You want to see some more? We got a lot of stuff.
Oh, let's see some more.
I think we better get out of here. I think we're being watched anyway.
Good idea.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Marc Davis was a big effect on my life. Amazing designer. Thank you so much. And many Many horrible apologies for going late to my friend Chris here, but that's it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.